The village of Thornley Green lay folded gently into the rolling hills of southern England, the kind of place where time moved not in hours, but in teacups, seasons, and parish announcements. Honey-coloured cottages bordered the narrow lanes, their gardens bursting even in early spring with daffodils and tidy hedgerows. At the centre of the village stood St. Edmund's Church, its grey stone softened by decades of moss and rainfall, its bells reliable enough to set one's watch by if anyone in Thornley Green felt any urgency to do so. A modest stream wound behind the churchyard, and beyond it rose the proud but slightly austere Thornley Manor, an old country house belonging to the Banfield family for nearly a century. Though not grand by aristocratic standards, the manor possessed an undeniable presence, tall bay windows, faded green shutters, and an oak door that creaked like an elderly gentleman clearing his throat. In a corner cottage not far from the church lived Miss Jane Marple, who had come to Thornley Green for a prolonged stay at the invitation of her old school friend, the vicar's wife, Margaret Helm. Miss Marple, a slight woman with bright, searching eyes and an unassuming manner, passed most mornings tending wool, roses, or the mysteries of human nature, the latter being her particular expertise. Village life was seldom dull to her, for calm surfaces often concealed interesting depths. Still, even she could not have predicted the stir caused by the arrival of Mrs. Adelaide Everleigh, the widow who had ordered her own grave. Mrs. Everleigh first appeared in Thornley Green on a mist-washed afternoon, stepping from a hired motor-car outside Grimsby and Sons Funeral Directors, a small brick establishment run by the solemn but dependable Mr. Tobias Grimsby. The driver opened her door, revealing a tall woman draped in a long charcoal coat, gloves immaculate, hat veiled, posture precise. She carried the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Inside the funeral parlour she made her unusual request without trembling or melodrama. "I should like to arrange my burial plot immediately." Mr. Grimsby blinked behind his spectacles. "My condolences, madam. May I ask, is this for a relative?" She folded her gloved hands. "For myself." The pause that followed was thick enough to butter toast. Mrs. Everleigh was not elderly no more than early 50s, though grief had carved thin shadows beneath her eyes. Her husband, Reginald Everleigh, a wealthy industrial consultant, had died 2 years earlier in London, leaving her childless, affluent, and if gossip was to be trusted quietly lonely. By evening the story had spread like raspberry jam at a fete. At the Blue Robin Terrum, Mrs. Pritchard, the baker's wife, whispered, "Mark my words, a woman who plans her grave is either dramatic or frightened of something." Mr. Wycliffe, the retired solicitor, countered, "Perfectly sensible, if you ask me. Far better than leaving paperwork to the panicked." Miss Marple listened from her table by the window, stirring tea thoughtfully. "Quite so," she said mildly, "but the question is not whether it is sensible, but why it is urgent." Her words floated into the room like a loose thread waiting to be pulled. Mrs. Everleigh did not remain a mystery for long. She rented Meadowbrook House, a quiet manor-style estate at the edge of the village, near the woods. She kept a housekeeper, Miss Clara Finch, a diligent, tight-laced woman who had worked for the Everleighs for a decade, and spoke sparingly but knew everything. There was also a gardener, Mr. Hargreaves, a quiet man who trimmed shrubs with the devotion of a sculptor. The widow attended church dutifully, but not sociably. She was polite, yet distant, the sort who thanked you for conversation and then closed the door on it. Yet she did invite a small circle to dinner one evening, all of whom would later become suspects in a most perplexing murder. The guests included Mr. Lionel Banfield, owner of Thornley Manor, genial but financially strained; Mrs. Vivian Banfield, his elegant, perceptive wife, sharper than her husband; Dr. Samuel Crane, the village GP, methodical, dependable, but nursing professional frustrations; Miss Ophelia Drake, wealthy spinster, president of the Thornley Horticultural Society, competitive by nature; Mr. Julian Rowe, a charming young estate agent who had handled the rental of Meadowbrook House; Mr. Arthur Pell, husband's former business partner, visiting from London, discreet, calculating, faintly secretive. The dinner was civil, warm, and gently barbed. Ophelia Drake remarked, "A burial plot by spring. Most peculiar timing." Mrs. Everleigh smiled faintly. Life has a way of becoming short when one finally begins paying attention to it. Julian Rowe, ever smooth, said, "Well, if you need help choosing headstone fonts, I know a fellow." Lionel Banfield laughed too loudly, perhaps a man eager for levity. Arthur Pell said nothing, but Clara Finch later recalled he studied the widow, as though appraising a figure on a balance sheet. Miss Marple, invited as courtesy, not intimacy, observed the table like a gardener noting blight before it spread. She thought privately, people who request graves are not always preparing for death. Sometimes they are trying to control it or prevent someone else from controlling it first. 3 days later, the village received news that would shift curiosity into alarm. Mrs. Everleigh was found dead, not in her ordered grave, but beside it. The sexton, Mr. Howard Gently, discovered her at dawn in the churchyard, collapsed near a freshly measured plot, marked with Everleigh's name on a small wooden stake. She lay peacefully, hands at her sides, expression still, too composed. No sign of struggle, no cry heard in the night. Only one peculiar detail, a funeral invoice clutched neatly in her coat pocket, signed by Grimsby and Sons, dated the previous day, stamped paid in full. But she was not meant to die yet, and someone in Thornley Green had known exactly where she would be. Dr. Crane confirmed death with professional calm, though his eyes narrowed at the faint smell of bitter almonds, subtle, almost ghost-like, but enough to prick a doctor's suspicion. "Curious," he murmured, "very curious. The coroner would later rule it heart failure, pending further toxicology." The village, however, was not inclined to wait for reports. Miss Marple walked the churchyard path that afternoon, leaning on her walking stick, eyes roaming the landscape of gravestones like old acquaintances. The Everleigh plot sat close to a yew tree, its branches low, roots twisting like old rumours. She knelt carefully to examine the soil. No footprints aside from the sexton's boots and the doctor's shoes. No sign of dragging. The earth was undisturbed, raked flat the previous evening. Mrs. Helm joined her. "Jane, dear, do you really think it's murder?" Miss Marple brushed soil from her gloves. "I think it is intention, and intention is always worth investigating. The dinner guests were interviewed first." The Banfields' Lionel Banfield was shocked sincerely. Miss Marple believed, but worry flashed beneath the grief. The plot was paid for. She seemed so determined. Vivian Banfield added, tone velvety, determined to plan, not to perish. They had no key to the churchyard, but Lionel admitted he once loaned Howard Gently a set for repairs. Dr. Crane, he confessed professional irritation. "People always think I miss details. I don't. I simply don't dramatize them." He had advised her recently on stress, not death. Ophelia Drake, competitive even in sorrow. "I suggested spring was impractical for gardening, not dying. Her alibi was a horticultural society meeting that lasted till 9 p.m. Julian Rowe charming, shaken, but curiously defensive. I handled her rental, not her tombstone. He joked too early, too quickly. Arthur Pell measured grief, measured words. Reginald would have hated sentiment, but Adelaide always liked order. He confirmed he saw her last leaving the Terroom yesterday at 5 p.m. Then came the housekeeper, Clara Finch. She spoke without tremor. Madame visited the church alone yesterday evening, said she wanted to see the measurements in the quiet. She carried tea in a flask. Tea, thought Miss Marple. Tea solves much and conceals more. Miss Marple inspected the flask later. Empty, rinsed clean, too clean. She also noticed the invoice was paid electronically, not in person. The widow had recently changed her will, placing a generous donation to St. Edmund's Restoration Fund. Reginald's insurance pay out included a clause releasing Pell from shared liabilities. Liabilities, financial, emotional, mortal, always leave traces. That night Miss Marple reviewed her notes, knitting needles clicking softly. Who benefits most from a grave ordered too soon? She whispered to the wool. By morning she had a theory. A second clue emerged: a torn corner of a typed letter found snagged on new bark near the plot. Only a fragment remained. You must not change anything now. The consequences would be typed, not handwritten, cold warning, not warm counsel. Julian Rowe admitted the letter resembled a font used in his office. But fonts are common, guilt is rarer. Arthur Pell claimed Reginald once used the same stationery supplier, but suppliers supply many, motives supply few. Miss Marple uncovered tensions. Ophelia Drake had competed with Adelaide over a charity flower show donation. Dr. Crane had argued with Pell regarding clinic funding. Lionel Banfield owed Pell money quietly, indirectly, but owed nonetheless. A red herring was dangled deliberately, she felt, like a fox leaving a false trail. Then another event raised stakes. Clara Finch received a call threatening grave vandalism unless the widow's plot was reopened. Reopened, thought Miss Marple. Someone wanted access or doubt. The toxicology report finally arrived. Poison detected digitalis and cyanide in mild concentration. Enough to kill quietly, enough to look natural, enough to be planned. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. No one orders a grave to lie beside it. Someone had ensured she did. Miss Marple reconstructed the evening. She carried a flask of tea. She visited the plot alone. No struggle. Invoice paid the day before. Letter warning her to not change anything. Poison chosen to mimic natural failure. Only one conclusion formed. She was not frightened of dying. She was frightened of someone discovering she was meant to die later, not now. The grave was misdirection, the timing was the message. She called a small gathering in the church vestry, the suspects, the vicar, the doctor, the sexton. A grave ordered early is not prophecy. She began, it is leverage. Arthur Pell stiffened. She continued, Reginald Everleigh did not die of illness. He died of debt, and debt, when shared, becomes motive when forgiven. Silence. Mrs. Everleigh changed her will recently, not because she feared death, but because she feared betrayal. She turned gently to Pell. You paid the invoice to see if she would visit the plot, and when she did, you ensured she stayed. His mask cracked, measured no longer. She was going to expose the partnership fraud. He hissed, but she reached the plot before the insurance matured. I had to move faster. Moved faster. Digital payment, planted letter, doctored tea. Miss Marple nodded sadly. You weren't burying her. You were silencing her. Pell was arrested without spectacle. Thornley Green disliked spectacle. it preferred justice served neat like scones. The Restoration Fund received its donation regardless the village benefited from the truth even in tragedy. Mrs. Helm poured tea for Miss Marple afterward. You saw all this from a funeral invoice. Miss Marple smiled. No, dear, from the timing. People lie about death, but seldom about urgency. The church bells rang, spring returned, graves remained for the dead, not for warnings, and Thornley Green resumed gossip, as villages do, but now with admiration rather than unease. Order had been restored, but by deduction, not by tombstone. The days that followed Arthur Pell's arrest carried a peculiar quality, subdued yet humming with the invisible electricity that only a quiet English village can generate when its assumptions have been overturned. Thornley Green, for all its clipped manners and garden, trimmed composure, was a place that lived by narrative, and when the narrative shifted, even the hedges seemed to lean closer to listen. The constable who escorted Pell away was Constable Brimwell, a young but earnest man with a face permanently arranged into an expression of polite effort. He had expected a complicated arrest shouting, perhaps, or the melodramatic clatter of denial, but what he received was something far more chilling in its ordinariness, a man already defeated by his own arithmetic. Pell stepped into the police motor car, adjusted his cuff, and said only, "Do see that the U is trimmed properly." Everleigh disliked untidy things. Brimwell nearly dropped his notebook. It was the sort of remark that sent a shiver along the spine, not because it was threatening, but because it was human, incongruous, and dreadful in its civility. The car door clicked shut, firm as a full stop. In the village centre a ripple spread outward. At the Blue Robin Terroom, the same table that had hosted debates on burial timing now hosted a different conversation entirely. Mrs. Pritchard, cheeks powdered with flour from the morning's baking, leaned across the lace-covered tablecloth toward Mr. Wycliffe, lowering her voice in the respectful whisper of someone who wants to be overheard without appearing to intend it. "I always thought London consultants were tidy people. I suppose tidiness is not the same as innocence." Wycliffe adjusted his tie, pleased to participate in philosophical commentary. "Quite right. A tidy crime is still a crime, perhaps even more so, as it suggests preparation." Miss Marple, seated nearby with a modest pot of Earl Grey, listened with gentle amusement. She found the terroom particularly conducive to truth pastries loosen tongues, and teacups invite confidences. Mrs. Helm arrived soon after, her coat still scented faintly with church incense and damp wool. She sat opposite her friend, eyes soft with admiration and lingering sorrow. "Jane dear," she began, "I'm still trying to reconcile the woman who organized her own grave with the one who brewed tea for the choir on Tuesdays." Miss Marple lifted her teacup with the reflective pause of someone weighing human nature rather than evidence. "Adelaide Everleigh organized her grave for the same reason she organized the choir biscuits. She wished to impose certainty on a world that had begun to feel perilously uncertain." Helm blinked. Uncertain. She seemed so composed. "Composed people are often the ones trying hardest to prevent collapse." Marple replied, "The grave was not surrender, it was strategy, for strategy had indeed been at the heart of it. Adelaide Everleigh had not been a woman enamoured with death. Rather, she had been a woman beginning to glimpse the machinery turning around her life, financial machinery, interpersonal machinery, and ultimately mortal machinery. Reginald Everleigh's death had left more than widowhood behind. It had left obligations, debts, dependencies, and a partner who had built his future on the assumption that she would remain silent. When Miss Marple had first arrived in Thornley Green weeks earlier, she had sensed the widow's urgency long before the crime itself took shape. It was not morbidness that coloured Adelaide's steps, but momentum, the forward lean of someone trying to outpace a trap closing quietly from behind. Now, in the wake of revelation, the village began the slower work of re-evaluation. The aftermath in Meadowbrook House. Clara Finch, the housekeeper, returned to Meadowbrook House the morning after the arrest with a dust cloth in one hand and grief arranged into neat pleats. She was not a woman who allowed emotion to spill. She stored it, labelled it, and carried it like folded linen. The house itself felt altered. The drawing room's floral wallpaper remained perfectly cheerful cabbage roses in pink, sage-green leaves looping in endless repetition, yet the room felt somehow quieter, as though decorum itself had exhaled after holding its breath too long. The village postmaster, Mr. Tilling, had already delivered condolences and curiosity in equal measure. Letters arrived addressed to Clara from distant cousins, legal offices, charity committees, all seeking to recalibrate their understanding of Mrs. Everleigh. Now that she was no longer a whisper but a truth, Clara placed the morning tray by the window. One cup, one saucer, one spoon. She paused. For years she had laid 2 cups every morning, one for Reginald, one for Adelaide. Then only one, now none save memory. She whispered to the empty room, "You deserved better timing than this." The words did not need elaboration. Timing had been the village's first clue, and timing was now its elegy. Restoring calm the village way. Thornley Green restored calm not by forgetting, but by ritual. The same rituals that once cushioned gossip now cushioned healing. At St. Edmund's, the Restoration Fund Committee convened to discuss Adelaide's donation. Many worried whether accepting funds connected to murder might taint the church, but Miss Marple, invited not for ceremony but wisdom, dispelled that notion with a quiet clarity that felt like sunlight through old glass. The money was tainted by deception, she said, not by the woman who redirected it toward honesty. The committee agreed quickly, unanimously, gratefully. Churches, like villages, have bills too. The restoration work began. Roof tiles repaired belt. Our wood reinforced yew tree trimmed per Pell's odd request, but now repurposed as village symbolism rather than obedience. Villagers contributed what they could. Coins, time, tea, opinions. Order returned, not the brittle, ledger-based order Pell cherished, but the softer, human order Marple understood. Miss Marple's final deduction, refined one afternoon, a week after the arrest. Miss Marple returned alone to the churchyard. The spring wind carried the faint scent of wild garlic from the woods. The Everleigh plot sat quiet beneath the yew, measured but no longer menacing. Margaret Helm found her there. "You're thinking again, aren't you?" "Only tidying the truth," she replied. She explained her refined deduction not for the police, who already had confession and evidence, but for the symmetry of the story itself. Digitalis slowed the heart, cyanide quieted the end, tea delivered both politely. Grave plot ensured location, invoice payment timing ensured observation, planted letter ensured doubt, doubt ensured silence if deduction had failed. But deduction had not failed, because Miss Marple never investigated death. She investigated people who needed death to behave like coincidence. The grave, though purchased early, would now wait for the rightful occupant when the future not fear dictated its use. Clara Finch saw to that, liaising with the plot registrar and ensuring the stake remained but was weather, sealed against time, not interference. The widow's name, once spoken in tones of oddity, now carried a different inflection. Adelaide Everleigh, the woman whose final act reordered more than a burial plot. It reordered a village trust. Thornley Green did not canonize her, for villages seldom canonize, they absorb. They retell, they refine, and in every retelling Miss Marple remained the gentle hinge between assumption and understanding. A last tea at Blue Robin, the final scene quiet enough to miss, if one was not observant, unfolded, where all good conclusions do, over tea. Mrs. Pritchard placed a fresh scone before Miss Marple, warm and studded with currants, on the house Miss Marple, for timing well spotted. Marple smiled with modest satisfaction. "Thank you, dear, though timing is not spotted. It is noticed when something fails to match the rhythm around it." Wycliffe raised his cup, to rhythm then, and to the eyes that see when it falters. The village bells chimed the half-hour, not urgent, simply punctual. Miss Marple added softly, "And may we all arrange our graves out of prudence, never pressure." Tea was drunk. Calm resumed, and Thornley Green carried on wiser, warmer, and with a freshly trimmed, you standing guard over a truth rather than a warning.